We'll start with a bit of a kind of introduction of where we are and what people do. So Marjorie, perhaps you'd like to outline what SANE is and how you came to found it.
Goodness. Well, I founded SANE about 35 years ago. And I was an investigative journalist from the Sunday Times, working on the Insight team, working on investigations like the thalidomide. And then a lot of people came to me because of all the distress there was when they were closing down all the old hospitals and everyone was out in the community, but the families hadn't been given the support and there weren't the places to be. And I wrote a series of articles called The Forgotten Illness. And they made a big impact. And actually, under Rupert Murdoch, amazingly, I was allowed to found this new charity called SANE. And we have three aims. One is to raise awareness, education, and become a voice for people who were then very voiceless, not so much now, and to improve the services and understanding and fight stigma. The second aim was research, because we don't know what's happening in the mind and body. We're lagging behind in the whole world of mental illness. And we have a research centre in Oxford, which we have teams of people looking at different therapies and treatments. And the third thing we do is we provide a helpline. We're the only national helpline with specialists in mental health. And we're open every day of the year. And we have trained volunteers and professionals who call people and maybe see them through dark times.
Thank you. Let's perhaps go to the others, and then we'll talk about where we are now, because obviously the big, well, not elephant in the room, because we're going to talk about it, but COVID has changed everything. Ginny, so what's your role within the NHS Trust?
Yeah, so I'm a clinical psychologist and I work within the Improving Access to Psychological Therapy service in Camden, and we're also known as iCope in Camden. So we're very linked to our GP surgeries in primary care, and we're accessible to patients also, or service users, through self-referral as well. So and I've been working in that arm of the service for many years. I also lead the long-term solutions arm of the service, and we've been doing a lot of work around people with long COVID or post-COVID syndrome in the last year. So it's been quite an intense year, actually, as well as trying to support other people in the community, our staff members in the community as well, locally in our local hospitals and across the NHS, because staff have also been struggling this year. So we've been doing quite a lot in our mental health arm of the service in primary care.
And Phil, I assume, well, you'll have seen similar things, but what's your role kind of in practice in the services?
Right. Okay. Well, I've been a GP for over 40 years. So I'm still practicing as a GP, but I do a lot of work around mental health. And my aim is I want to improve both mental well-being and also the services for people who are struggling with mental health problems. And both of those arms of this are important. I'm part of something called Thrive London, which is seeking to improve the mental well-being of all Londoners. And it's a whole thing about getting this out into the open, so people talking about how they're getting on mentally and emotionally, so that it becomes less stigma and people are more ready to take action to improve their health, but also to get help when they need it.
Absolutely. Perhaps we'll bring Marjorie back in quickly now, because on the SANE Helplines volunteers, we'll have heard firsthand from people, as will our other panelists, but we'll have heard firsthand on what the issues are at the moment and what's changed over the last year. So Marjorie, do you want to paint a picture of that? Oh, we've just got you muted. Can we get Marjorie unmuted? Oh, you're still muted. Well, perhaps while we try and sort out that technical issue, Phil, do you want to tell us where you think we are?
Can you hear me now?
Ah, okay. Let's go to Marjorie.
I'm sorry, I'm back. Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
No, that's okay. I think
yes, over the last year, Andre, over the last year, we have seen a tremendous rise in the severity of people's anxiety and depression. we've changed the way that we work. We normally just have a helpline that people answer. Now people are leaving their number and our trained people are calling them back, and that makes a more personal relationship. So we learn a bit more about their stories. There's been quite an alarming rise in the numbers of people talking about suicide, not suicidal thoughts, but suicidal plans. There's been a continuing rise. It was pre-pandemic on self-harm. And this is something about 80% of people calling us talk about self-harm. And that is very concerning to us, because when I started the helpline about 25, 30 years ago, we had very few calls about self-harm. And now that's a lot of the calls are, and it's sometimes very serious self-harm. We've also had a lot more calls from families, carers who haven't been able to reach people they're really concerned about. You know, say they have a suicidal son or an anorexic daughter, they haven't been able to reach them. And because the services have been so depleted, the normal community teams, they've had COVID, they've been depleted, they've been fragmented, they are left in a limbo, and they have been really, really frightened about what would happen to somebody that they care about. So those are the sorts of changes that we've had in our helpline, and we're trying to meet that every day. We get hundreds of calls, and the picture is the same almost, this wonderful raising of awareness, like you've just been talking about in Thrive. It's amazing. When I started saying it was confused, mental illness was confused with mental handicap, there was been no chance of a day like today that you're giving to it. Nobody talked about it. It was taboo and totally misunderstood by the government and by everybody else. So you had tectonic change in awareness, including the royals, as we've heard today, but it has not been met by what people reach the front line. When they want to get help, they are now turned away almost as often as when I started saying all those years ago, because there are not enough beds available. There's very little crisis places for people to go. They're often taken to police custody cells, or they're driven hundreds of miles across the country, or they're just simply sent home and on a wing and a prayer that nothing worse happens, that when they're suicidal or they're feeling totally distressed. So it's been a sort of mismatch between a wonderful raising of awareness and not improving the way that people get the help when they need it most.
Sure. Ginny, you're nodding there. Perhaps you'd like to come in about what the Trust's doing and how it's working at the moment.
No, absolutely. I would say I'd agree with everything Marjorie said in terms of the volume of people who are needing help, and actually there being a mismatch between that and the services that exist for people. What I will say is about, certainly in primary care, I think there's different stages to this. So it sounds like, Marjorie, you're talking about people at the extreme end of things, actually, and they're already at the point where they need urgent help or crisis intervention. And actually, there are services that fit in a little bit earlier than that now, and the raising awareness, particularly for my services like improving access to psychological therapies, it's all about getting help as soon as you need it, when there are warning signs, well before you've got to the point where you're struggling at the end of the line. And we have tried to make ourselves very available in that we do have a self-referral line, because people were struggling to access their GPs and get appointments, and that was an issue. And we often see people who are struggling in the mild to moderate end of mental health difficulties, and so then we're sort of available sooner before it gets to that point. And I think the awareness has really helped with that, because it means that we can sort of be available for people, offer skills, strategies. There's a lot of services that support carers and relatives, and we often invite and support family members as part of our work where that's appropriate, and when we've got permission to do that from our clients. So we're sort of, I think, probably talking about different ends. I'm representing a different end of the spectrum, and also, I mean, I've worked in mental health services for the last 10 to 12 years, so I guess I've seen a different side of the services than maybe both Phil and Marjorie have over the years, and it's a side where actually people are far more open about mental health and talking about mental health, and it feels very positive actually for many of the people I'm working with.
I mean, I agree with you on that side, but the trouble is that during this pandemic, people who have quite serious clinical depression and serious mental illness, they seem to be getting squeezed out more and more, because they're not able to go and access, and they've maybe had their sessions of cognitive behavior therapy and their psychological therapies. And they are also feeling that their problems aren't equal to the problems of people with COVID. And they've been very reluctant to go and seek help. And of course, the more they go on untreated, the more the crisis builds up. And so people are getting to flashpoint much more readily, partly because of fear, partly because of the feeling disconnected from everything around them, and partly because when they have gone for help, sometimes the crisis lines, I'm sure it's not yours, have said kind of platitudes like, oh, we'll have a cup of tea, go for a walk. There's the mental health apps. They haven't matched the severity of their crisis. And I think what I'm looking at more, as you said, the other spectrum, is at what happens when a person's in crisis. They go to A&E, where they're often triaged to the bottom and they're sent home. And there's no crisis beds available for them, and they don't feel safe. And I think you're absolutely right. There's been a wonderful increase in psychological therapies, but then when people do reach that flashpoint, they still find there's nowhere to go.
Well, let's bring Phil in here, because so you're co-chair of the suicide prevention group.
Yes.
So obviously that is at the extreme end. What's your observations, yes, Phil?
Okay, let me take two ends of the spectrum, if I may. I'm a GP. And we've all had an unprecedented year and a bit. It's been crazy. And what we've seen is people with severe mental and emotional distress. And that's something that's affected all of us to a large extent. And the vast majority of us will get through emotional distress with the help and support of friends and family. But there are some of us who will need additional help. And I think the problem has partly been that people who need that additional help have been reluctant to come forward, partly because of fear that they're going to expose themselves to COVID, partly because there's been a perception that services aren't open, whereas all the services have been open all the way through the crisis. So there's been a tendency for them to leave it late and present at a later stage in their illness when they've really got to a crisis point. And one of the things we're trying to do is to improve those crisis services markedly. In our area, we have things like a crisis cafe, we've got a crisis house where people can go, so that there are alternatives. A&E is the last place you should be if you're in a mental health crisis, and we're working very hard to find alternatives to that. At the other end, in terms of suicide, one of the interesting things is that there has been no clear rise in suicide over this pandemic. And it's very interesting, if you look at other crises over history, you get an initial fall, which we saw in COVID, and then it flattens out. And sometimes there's a bit of a rise later. So we're monitoring it very, very closely so that we can pick up as soon as there is any issue. We have a system that goes across London where we report any possible suicides so that we can get into families and to friends with support and advice and bereavement support so that people are able to get through this in a more effective way. And we're doing a lot about raising awareness around suicide prevention. In London, almost 250,000 people have undertaken some online suicide prevention training, so they know how to approach somebody who is feeling suicidal. It only takes 20 minutes online, and it's very easy to do, and it gives you the tools to be able to go and not feel lack of confidence in approaching people. So those are two ends of the spectrum. A lot more we could say in between, but that's just the start.
Thank you. We've had a bit of background noise, so I don't know if there's any noise in any panelists' houses or anything, but or if the volume's up too high in your machine, it might feed back. So if everybody can just turn it down a little bit, that would be great. And when we come to you next, we'll just need to ask you to unmute. Perhaps it would be good to kind of go to stage one. So Chinny, would you be able to unmute? And maybe my question really is, if you're struggling, or if you're starting to feel you're struggling, what do you actually do first? What is the first step?
One thing I'd like to say is that, and Phil mentioned this, that we've all struggled at some point over this last year. It's been an intensely, a very difficult year for everybody, tremendously. And I would say that there's a period of what I would say almost like a watchful waiting. Like we don't want to pathologize everybody who might be struggling at the moment, because everybody has struggled actually, and there's a term that a colleague of mine uses, that we're all going through a sort of collective depression at the moment because of the period. You know, we've not been able to connect to all the things that matter. We haven't been able to connect to our family and friends. We've not been able to be social in the way that we usually would, and that can sometimes be a source of boosting our mood. So I would first of all say that actually we don't want to over pathologize everybody right now who might be struggling, and some of those techniques and simple things that people might suggest when you access services or when you talk to somebody on a phone line, they can be quite powerful. But then if you find that you are continuing to struggle over a period of several weeks, things that you're doing or being that things are being suggested to you aren't working, you don't feel connected to people, and you don't feel like you want to be connected to people anymore, actually, as we're coming out of lockdown as well, then the first thing would be to consider try and talk to your GP if you can get an appointment to do that, if it feels comfortable for you. But also you can self-refer to IAPT services. IAPT meaning improving access to psychological therapy services like mine in Camden, and they're available in every borough. And at the moment, most of our services are offering almost an immediate access to help. So we have all been trained in sort of psychological therapies, but we're offering psychologically informed brief interventions to some people, particularly in Camden and Islington, where we would try to see people as soon as possible in order to get in there sooner, rather than leaving them waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks before they access something. And that's available to anybody who might be struggling and might need some immediate support. And then we might do some signposting, we might do some interventions with them at that point. And these are brief interventions. And they've been developed for people with long-term health conditions like long COVID, but also for people who might just have common mental health problems like anxiety and depression. So that's certainly available across Camden and Islington. I can speak for my boroughs. I'm not so sure about what's going on elsewhere, but I know that IAPT service leads are working so hard to try and make ourselves available to people quickly, but also marry that with the fact that there are people who have accessed the service previously who would have been waiting as well. So we're thinking a lot about that. And then that's the first step, I think. And if people have ongoing mental health problems or severe or moderate mental health problems where they're already accessing community services or they're struggling to access their community services, then the first point of call often would be trying to speak to or liaise with your GP about how to access help and what else is out there for you if you're not able to get into some of those services. And I think that the good thing that we do in Camden and Islington was we're so connected to our GPs in primary care that we try to work together. We've got lots of opportunities for meeting together as professionals in what we call multidisciplinary spaces, and we talk about what to do to try and support people as best we can. But I think early on, trying not to over pathologize what people might be struggling with right now, because I think many people are struggling. But also, if you are continuing to struggle, then there is help out there. And so that's from the psychological therapies side of things. But I'm sure, and there are also all of these statutory services that are helping people too. So I'll open the floor for maybe Marjorie and Phil.
Well, I mean, I just want to pick up on the collective depression, your colleagues phrase there. It's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously this is a new situation for the world and for us. And at certain stages, I can only really speak personally, I guess, but firstly, there was the horror of what was happening last year, but also there's a slight excitement because these are major events and there's an adrenaline to that. But then there was also, for me, a phase of slight relief in that, oh, actually, all those societal pressures of other people, I can just sit back, do my work, watch TV and read a book, and it's life's slightly simpler for a while. But of course, by losing all those community sides of things, you also lose the good bits as well, and the bits that that support you. And so I suppose what I'm saying is I think we're still working out where we're going with this and what the next stage of how we're dealing with this is. Marjorie, have you seen a change in the kind of calls as the pandemic's progressed?
Yes, we have. I mean, it always sounds great what's on offer, but often people just don't get there. And the change is that people are more desperate than they were before, that that their level of despair is higher. Now, I accept actually what you just said. The actual suicide rate hasn't gone up, but the levels of despair are higher. And I think loneliness, we all know that loneliness can be a killer, and that actually your chances of premature death is 42% higher if you're also reporting yourself as highly lonely. So I think loneliness has played a huge part in this, not just being alone, but being feeling lonely in your family or being alone. And it's different from isolation. It's an emotion. I think we've had more of that. And then we've had the fact that because the teams have not been able to go out to visit people, the normal support system hasn't been there. People have felt very adrift. And quite a lot of people don't like the digital communication. A lot of people calling us. So what we would like to say is that calling a helpline like ours is actually quite a good start, maybe, before pathologizing. And I do agree with you, before you sort of get labels and so on. Calling a helpline like ours, where you can just work through what you are you having what everybody's feeling? Some depression, some low moods, uncertainty, all those fears, or are you actually being triggered into a form of mental illness? And that's the important line that we always try and look at, that sort of trigger point, and why some people, as you were saying, some people are resilient, and it's not nobody's fault. We want to get away from the whole idea of shame and blame, that it's your fault that you happen to be unable to ride through a crisis and other people can, that it's part of your genetic makeup, it's part of your background, it's not your fault. And that's what we want to get across, because people are blaming themselves. Why am I suffering like this? And other people are doing fine. Why? They're going to exercise groups, they've joined this, they've done that. I can't get out of the house. I'm just looking at the four walls, and they've got the double whammy. They've got the four walls of their room that they're looking at, and feeling isolated, too afraid to go out, but they know going out there is just as bad. And that, I think, has changed, is the idea that there is no place that's safe for them to be. That's been one thing, just being disconnected and feeling unsafe.
And of course, in a way, it's self-feeding, isn't it? Because you can look at people and think, oh, well, they're doing fine. Why am I not? Of course, they're probably not doing fine either. They'll have their own things going on as well.
Problems. But
Exactly.
It's very good to be able to talk to our sort of people, because what we train people to do is not to be mental health specialists, to be like almost normal reporters, like I was and you are, is to tell your story. And we look at their story as a normal reporter would be, as they tell their story. And we also call them back. And this is what other helplines don't do. We would say, well, would you like us to ring you back in a few days' time or in a week's time? And the fact that you actually ring them and are interested in them can make a huge difference. And that can actually take away some of the feeling of feeling there's nobody there. And I think that kind of relationship can prevent people getting into much more serious crisis. So we actually do this ongoing, we call it ongoing support, and follow up with people if they want it. Obviously, if they don't, we don't ring them again. But we have email and other services. But if they feel, so it's not just one call and you end the call. You've had your crisis and you end the call. We say, we'll ring you again, see how you are. And that we find gives people a much more of a sense of being able to go through the next few days, relax, because they know that there's somebody going to be in touch with them.
I just want to add something. I just think that's so important, Marjorie, and so it's just holding people in mind at a time where people have felt so alone, actually. And I think it's so important, and having that connection with somebody, telling your story and having that space to do that, so powerful. And it's really important to hear you saying about what people do and how these helplines can be so a first step and a first line. And I think that one thing I wanted to flag about, you mentioned, Andre, about this collective depression. We're talking about what has happened to people rather than people wondering, like, why me, for instance, about their mental health. It's what's happened to people over a period of time. And there are some people who've had tremendous struggles, but don't necessarily acknowledge the struggles that they might have faced over the years. And that might not just be about what's been happening over the last year. It might be a cumulative thing. There's lots of people who are struggling this year because of everything that's been going on with Black Lives Matter and all of the feelings that come up around that, about feeling experiences of discrimination and prejudice that might be around and might have been a drip effect, and then suddenly something happens and they're really struggling. And I think that there are all of these things that happen to people sometimes, but they just look at the problem and think that they are the problem, and actually it's sometimes what's been going on around them. And having somebody to talk to about that and who holds you in mind and really is interested and curious, so powerful. And those first contacts with services like Marjorie's, like ours sometimes, can be so important for holding and creating that space.
Phil, you might want to come in on
yeah.
lots of that, but I've also got a very practical question from
Yeah.
somebody. Is if you're going through a crisis, is it better to continue working or take time off?
Okay, I'll answer that as I go through it.
Sure.
Would that be okay, Andre?
Of course.
What I wanted to say is I want to come back to this thing about blame, because it's so important that we don't add to the other struggles we're having by feeling guilty for where we're at. When we're coping with something, we draw on our resources. We draw on our resources inside, from friends and family around, and we've all got different levels of those resources related to our genetics, to our history, to our upbringing, to our social situation, to our physical health, a whole variety of things that aren't our fault. That's just life. And so some of us run out of those resources earlier than others because of all of those factors. So it's not a matter of blame. It is a matter of recognizing it and being honest with ourselves and saying, yes, I can recognize that I am now struggling beyond just feeling the distress of the situation, so we can then go and get help. So it is very important that we have that self-recognition. That's where social contact is often very helpful, because what we do with people around us is we play that off them, and they give us some feedback as to the way they are. And they'll say things to us like, "You're not so well today, are you?" And it gives us the opportunity to reflect and say, well, maybe I'm not. Maybe I am struggling at the moment. And that social contact is something we've lost. In fact, this whole year has been a year of loss. We've lost social contact. We've lost contact with loved ones and family. We have lost the ability to manage things financially for many people. Many people are losing that financial security. We've lost loved ones and we've been bereaved. And any loss means we grieve over it. And some people get through the grieving and some don't. At least 1 in 10 people, normal bereavement they struggle with, and it takes a longer time. So when we're all going through this kind of bereavement process because of all that we've lost through the pandemic, it's a natural reaction to have that grieving and the struggle. And some of us will normally take longer and find it more difficult. That will be made worse by the lack of contact with others. If you can't grieve properly over a lost loved one because you haven't been able to have a proper funeral and say goodbye and have the support from family and friends, it is that much more difficult. So it is very, now I want to use this word carefully, but it is very normal that we're all having a struggle. And it is very normal and natural that some will be having a bigger struggle than others and will need some help and support. It is no worse than that. And I think that what we can do is really help support people through that process. If I can come to this question about do you go to work or not, I think that is very, very difficult to give a blanket answer to. It depends on the individual. I've dealt with people who've come to see me in the surgery and we have talks about it, and they said, actually, being at work keeps me sane. It keeps me in contact with people. It means that I've got a purpose to get up in the mornings. If I don't do that, I'm not going to be able to carry on. Other people say, getting up in the morning to go to work is absolutely destroying me. I can't cope with that any longer. And it all depends on what the situation is as to whether we'd say, yes, going to work is good. As a general principle, working is good for us. We all do much better when we've got that kind of purpose and that structure to our lives, but we need to adapt that to individual circumstances so that we can really help people get into a situation where they've got the time, the space, the energy, the mental thinking ability to begin to work through all of those things. And in all of this, it's not helped by Zoom and by virtual working, because it doesn't give that kind of personal contact. You know, the corridor conversations that we have and the kind of the one-off comments. You go by somebody, how are you doing today? And they say fine. And you know well when they say fine, they don't really mean fine. And you can go back and talk to them. It's not as easy to pick up on your own pictures like this, although it's better than nothing. And I think all of those things have all added to people's difficulty in really getting through on this and being able to get the kind of support from work colleagues, from social colleagues, and so on, that actually is needed to keep us in good shape. And one of the things that is very clear from the evidence is that that social contact is one of the things that makes us resilient and keeps us in good shape and stops us going down a spiral when we're under stress. So a lot more I could say, but let me give the others a chance to come in, Andre.
Well, let's hope that things do start to ease now, and that social contact does help a lot of us.
Absolutely.
I think one thing it leads on to, actually, we'll come to you, Marjorie, but I'll also ask you a specific question, which is, if you do feel that there's somebody you know who's having problems or going to have problems, what should you do? Marjorie, perhaps you'd like to talk around that.
Well, I think you get in contact, either if you self-refer or if you can come to a helpline, and then you say, are you doing the most you can? Because often what the families are the most overlooked, and it's sometimes they're not all wonderful GPs like you. Often the GP doesn't really include the family, and then this confidentiality is a big problem, is it? Because people are adult, the families can't be told what's wrong with them, or whether they really are pretty ill, or whether they're just, suffering like the rest of us. So I think the first thing is to sort of learn to decide, whether you are doing everything you can do. And the second thing is to navigate the mental health services, to know about the services that are available. And our job is to do that, is to move people on. We don't just take and absorb calls. We want to move people on to find out where they can get that help and so on. Yes. And I think that's very important. What I was going to actually say is that on a brighter side, is that quite a lot, brighter and not brighter, quite a lot of the people ringing us, they're not working. A large proportion of people aren't in work at all because they're on benefits, they can't work. And what we've found is that this last year, we've been giving away what these arts grants, creative potential grants. And we give £200, £300 to people to go on courses, to get materials, and to try and discover their own inner resources, to try and say, look, if you've got a nice lot of paint there and an easel, not art therapy as such, because these are people already quite talented or have shown anything, but it has been a chance for some people to develop those creative sides of them and inner potential sides of them. And I think that's a slightly, one positive side of the fact of the loss you're saying, is that turning that loss into something that taps into yourself and that you're not frightened of anymore, because you're getting help with it. Somebody's saying, that's worth, they send in their artwork or their things to us, and we have artists, and we judge that they're deserving of £100, and in their name, not in anybody else. They don't have to go. Then it's giving some faith to people that they have got something to offer, gets over a lot of the loss.
Ginny, perhaps you'd like to come in there. I know you're concerned, or one of your concerns is about people struggling with work and finances and that side of things. Do you want to talk on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few things I'd love to comment on as well from what you've all said. And I think there's something about work in terms of what is work and how do we define that, right? So I think that for many people, work is a huge part of their identity, and without it, that becomes a major loss. We were talking about things that happen to people. If people who have lost their jobs over this period of time, or who are not working, and the way they view being in work and what it means to work is a huge part of their identity. It's a sense of status. It's a sense of a kind of an aspect of their character, then it becomes a major loss for people. And I think that that's when maybe mental health difficulties can creep in. And having and not being able to have conversations with people about that and about the other things about their lives that make them valued and of value to society and to people in their networks, it means that then builds up and then people struggle. Okay, so I just want to say something about how we define work, and there are other things that people can connect to that might mean that they're doing something. So there's a sense of vocation, a sense of feeling good about oneself through things like art projects, through things other skills that they have that allow them to develop. And I think that for our services, we have lots of employment workers who are linked in or embedded within IAPT services, and we might sometimes connect them to our employment support workers within IAPT if somebody does have a mental health problem and they've come to us for that problem. But then there are also what we call peer workers and people who work in primary care who are supporting people to look at what is around and what's available, so that they don't feel like they're alone in struggling with returning to work, for instance, or not being in work, or the confidence to get back into work again, or struggling with financial issues. And there are new services and charities that have been set up around supporting people with financial problems at the current time. And I think that it's important that we can signpost people, as Marjorie said, to all of this support that's out there that people might not know about, because they're just sometimes quite blinkered in how one might be thinking when one is struggling with intense emotions and intense worries and stresses that can become overwhelming.
I'm conscious I probably want to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so, and I don't want to miss this opportunity to talk about long COVID, which, Chinny, I know is your area as well, because obviously physical and mental health are not unrelated. You know, they're closely connected, if not the same thing. And there are physiological effects that people have at the moment. Do you want to tell us what we know at the moment and how it's affecting people?
Absolutely. So I would say that with long COVID, so the definition at the moment is very just come out in NICE guidelines in December, and it's very much about so long COVID is a term that patients and service users have developed, long haul COVID, so it's existing COVID symptoms that seem to be long lasting and haven't shifted over time, but there's also a term called post-COVID syndrome, which is the sort of medical terminology. And it's very much for people who might be struggling after having COVID or COVID-like symptoms. They might not have had a positive test to say that they had COVID, but they're continuing to struggle with the physical symptoms linked to that. So that can include breathlessness, struggling with activity and exercise and not being sure why, fatigue. They can include brain fog and not being able to think clearly. There are a whole host of symptoms that we're still working out what long COVID is really. And it's just for people who've really struggled after having COVID that this is a terminology that people should become aware of. And the first thing to do if you feel that you have this ongoing experience of long COVID is that you should be sort of checking in with your GP and having a primary care assessment of those symptoms, because there could be some worrying things that could be going on, or it might be that there's support out there to help you manage those symptoms. And I think at the moment lots of people just aren't aware, many people aren't aware of the services that exist because things have been so closed down recently. And I think it's important that people do know about this and start to think about long COVID as a terminology, language, and what to do to get help. And the GPs and the primary care networks are being really educated about the different pathways that exist within the community.
So the message really is to not ignore it if you think you've got symptoms that are persisting and didn't go away in the 2 weeks or a month or so.
Don't ignore it. Speak about it with your GP. They will probably speak to you on the phone initially, but you will be able to at least get those symptoms explored and thought about. It's very important.
GPs are well prepared for this. They are aware of long COVID. They're seeing a lot of people with long COVID. Most of them you can deal with in primary care, but they're probably about 1 in 10 are going to need secondary care in the hospital, in outpatients and so on. And the services that have been set up for those, and most GPs should be aware of those in their local area. So please don't hesitate to speak to your GP if you are concerned. But be aware that GPs are very overloaded at the moment. They're talking in terms of 400% increase in the number of phone calls that are coming through. So it is quite difficult, and sometimes there'll be a bit of a delay, but stick in there, don't give up, and make sure that you get through. You can do it online, you can do it on the phone, sometimes email is used. Don't give up, make sure that you get through to them, because there is help available for you.
I think that as we wrap up, we've had a question which is around a kind of list of what the resources are out there and what there is for people. Obviously, there's a lot, and it's quite complicated. But perhaps we could each bullet point the main steps to take and the main services to be aware of. Phil, do you want to start?
Yeah, I've put on our internal chat a number of resources that are online, and I appreciate some people are not online, but just for those who are, that are useful, and perhaps Ham&High can make those known to people who've been on the call a bit later. The first one I would go to is the Good Thinking website for London, which is free to all Londoners. It's got a number of resources and apps there that can help people. It will also direct them to other treatments and make sure that they're connected up with somebody that can help them. Thrive London Resources has got a lot of stuff there that is available. There are resources for debt management, for bereavement, and for a whole variety of things, including for crisis. And I've put a lot of links and phone numbers there that we can communicate to people. It is very complicated, I appreciate that, but if you want one place to start, go to the Good Thinking website, which is www.good-thinking.uk, and you can get access to a whole lot of stuff there. That's the one place you should probably start.
Thank you. Marjorie, from SANE, we've talked about the helpline. Is there anything more we should say about what the charity can do for people? You might need to unmute to be able to speak.
Yes, I mean, we have a forum, an online forum, so you can share experiences with people. We do emails. People can call, as I said, it's not just a telephone helpline. So we can be in touch with people. And as I say, we're launching our third arts, what we call creative arts scheme, actually in about 3 weeks' time. So we're there for that. I mean, what I would make a plea for, though, is that we can only do so much. You know, we're an entirely voluntary funded charity. We have no government funds. We can only do so much for people. My plea is that we do something urgently about the workforce and building up this workforce. People find it really difficult to see consultant psychiatrists because of the shortage. They see it difficult to have a consistent psychiatric team or nurse. They're always talking about the fragmentation of that, and they never see the same person. And the last thing I'd say is, in crisis, because we deal with people when they are getting to crisis, please, will the trust have crisis beds available, because it's terrible. The police are just at their wits' end. They don't know what to do. 40% of their time is going out to people in mental health crisis when they've nowhere really to take them. So my plea is, just let's have local crisis beds available for people when they reach that, so that they don't not sent home and then waiting for a team to come, and then they ring us saying the team hasn't come. I would just plead that we have those services there for them.
Ginny, do you want to address that, just what the situation is in Camden and Islington at the moment?
Well, I suppose so. I'm very much working in primary care, so my role isn't really around crisis management and crisis support. So I'm less able to comment on that, I'm afraid, Marjorie. But I can definitely take back your concerns and your question, your request to our trust service leads. I know we do have crisis houses, and I think that, you know, they have done the best that they can in the period that we've been in. But I think it sounds like there could be more that could be done, and more conversations that maybe need to happen to support people.
And Andre, every area now has a crisis line. Every trust has set in place a crisis line. It should, how well it's functioning might be variable, but it is there, and people should be using it if they are concerned. Absolutely.
There's a website that actually maybe we could share, Andre,
Sure.
with people. That is the link so that you can search for your local crisis just by looking at putting in your age and your postcode into a website. But also there is a crisis line for every borough in England anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. And is there anything else that you'd like to flag up at this stage as we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that if people are unsure and they're looking for support, so the iCope has a website for people who live in the boroughs of Camden and Islington, and also Kingston, because we also have an iCope in Kingston. And if people did want to have a look, there's lots of information, and we do signpost people on there. But if you're not sure, I think the best thing to do often is to check in with your networks around you, and that includes loved ones who might know about things that you might not know about support in the area, and also, yeah, trying to get through and persevere if you can't get through to GPs. I think that is a really important thing to be able to do as a first step.
Two things I'd like to say, Andre, is one, don't beat yourself up if you're struggling. Don't beat yourself up. Accept it, do something about it. And secondly, don't hesitate to get help when you get to that stage. Do it earlier rather than later, because it's much easier to help and intervene if you do it early.
I think that's oh, Marjorie, have you got one final bit? You're on mute at the moment. Do you want to unmute and give us a final word?
Yeah, I say, well, get in touch with people like us, because we can help reach these services that are available. It's www.sane.org.uk. And as I repeat that, don't feel afraid of that. There's no judgment. You're just talking to people who happen to have some understanding of how you might be feeling. And never, never underestimate the professional should never underestimate the severity of somebody's anguish, because they find it difficult to express it. And sometimes people feel that their problems are underestimated and are not on a par with physical illness. You know, somebody's there with heart pains. I've just got suicidal thoughts. You've got to say that your suicidal thoughts are just as important as that person's heart pain.
Yeah.